All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Max and Brenda Lapkovsky, in honor of the upcoming Bar Mitzva of their son Yitzhak Meir, Dr. Riva Mitzner In commemoration of the first yartzheit of her father, Dr. Larry Schneck. Yartzheit is today Aryeh ben Chaim Zichron Livracha, and Jack Bennett in honor of Sargent Omer TAVIV, who was killed by a Hamas Anti-Tank Missile on the Gaza border on May 12th, 2021. Our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Shmuel Tzivia Davis, in memory of Tzivia's brother, Kopel Melech ben Leib, Zichron Livracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. And also, one more sponsorship, to thank Howard Friedman for dedicating the shir this morning. Sorry, just give me one moment. Okay, for some reason now it's not downloading. Try it once more. Tila Bas Chaim. Thank you, Howard. Thank you. We hope that in the merit, whose yartzheit to say, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. But with that, let us begin. So we have a really exciting daf ahead of us today with some interesting halacha, a lot of interesting hashkafa as well. Today's daf is daf Chof 20. And we are picking up Emir Hashem on the bottom, towards the bottom of Yud Tes Amud Beis. Let's pick up Ella Amar Rava, 4 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, yesterday, where's Sammy? I just saw Sammy before. Sammy and I were talking about this at a chasana last night. Anytime I see Sammy, he's all Torah. I'm like, can we talk about something else just for 2 minutes? It's like, no, Torah. So we're speaking about the idea that it's fascinating to note that here, we think schach mats are like this brand new innovation, right? We found this great idea that no other generation ever thought about. That why go ahead and spend all the time putting up bamboo poles and putting up branches? Let's make mats. It's amazing that you see a Mishnah that deals with mats. So remember again, the topic we were discussing was the nature of a mat which can be used for schach. Let's talk about the issue for just a moment. The issue at play, of course, is one is not permitted to use something that is makabel tumah for schach, as we learned earlier. And what is makabel tumah? On a most basic level, a kli, anything utilized in a utensil capacity, is makabel tumah. So, for example, a bamboo mat. Is a bamboo mat makabel tumah? It depends. If it's used for shchiva, if it's used for laying down on, if it's used for sleeping, then it's a kli, and then ultimately it's makabel tumah. If it's makabel tumah, it cannot be used for schach. Conversely, if you have a mat that is not used for shchiva, not used for sleeping per se, then halacha l'maisa, and it was made, let's say, for schach, or again, that's going to be the point of contention, let's assume it was made for schach, then halacha l'maisa is totally usable. The issue that's going to come up is what happens if you have, and by the way, just to understand from the Gemara's perspective, small mats were usually associated with mats used for sleeping. When we say small, they're the size of a person, so they're used for sleeping, versus larger mats were just often created for schach. The question that we started dealing with yesterday, that we'll continue with today, is, what happens if you have a non-designated schach mat, right? What happens, again, you have this mat, and it wasn't made for any particular purpose. How does that play into this entire discussion? To which the Gemara says, 4 lines up from the bottom, Ela Amar Rava. So rather, Rava will say, explains the Gemara as follows. Begidola, kuli amalo pligi distam l'sichuch. When it comes to a large mat, everyone agrees, stamar. So if you have a large mat that was created, so again, even if it was not created with a particular designation, everyone will agree that halacha l'maisa, such a mat was made for schach purposes. Keep ligi. So where does the machlokes? And I will say, I want to be clear. Here's what's interesting, at least according to what Rav is saying right now. Do you need your schach mat to be made l'shem schach? What does it sound like? Do you need? No, right? You just what? You need it what? Not to be made l'shem kli. That's pretty much what's happening over. In other words, there's no din of schach l'shem schach. Although again, we'll see halacha l'maisa. It's not necessarily the case. But right now where Rav is coming from is, as long as it's not made for a kli purpose, then pretty much stama l'sichoch. So the Gemara says, Kipligi, where does the machlokis come up? Kipligi, bikitana. The machlokis that comes up is with a small mat. Tanakama savar stam kitana l'shchiva. So the Tanakama holds that a regular stam kitana, a regular small mat, if you find the small mat, the default designation of that mat is that it's used for sleeping. It's used for sleeping. Rabbi Eliezer savar stam kitana nami l'sichoch. Rabbi Eliezer on the other hand holds that no, anytime you find a mat that does not have a particular designation, you have the ability to go ahead and assume that it was made for schach purposes. V'hachi kamar, top of chaf. And this is how we're supposed to read the Mishnah. V'hachi kamar. Machatzelas hakanim gidola, if you have a reed mat that is large, asa'a l'shriva mikabeles tuma. So we'll say, obviously, even in a large mat, which is not normally made for people's individual uses. So even if you have a large mat, if you made it l'shchiva, if you made it for sleeping purposes, mekabelas tuma. Ultimately, again, it's mekabel tuma. Ve'in mesachachin ba. Remember again, these are corollary statements. If something is mekabel tuma, then by definition you cannot use it for schach purposes. Taima. Now the reason it's not usable is why? Because the mat was expressly made for shchiva, for use, for sleeping, which renders it a kli, which makes it mekabel tuma, which precludes its use from schach. Now we'll say, what can you infer from that? When is the large mat problematic? When is it problematic? Im asa l'shchiva. Now what does asa l'shchiva mean? What does it mean? You expressly designated it for a particular purpose for sleeping. What can you infer from that? Hastama, what happens if you didn't designate the mat? You didn't designate the mat at all. You just made a mat. You did not designate it in any particular way. Hastama, nasa kimi shasa l'sichoch misachachin ba. Ultimately, again, what you could infer from that is the only time that the large mat is problematic is if you expressly designated l'shchiva. But if you did not expressly designate it for sleeping on it, we could assume the default designation of a large mat is going to be for schach purposes. For schach purposes, because I skipped the parentheses. V'asra well say that's the opinion of the Tanakama. Right? So the Tanakama will hold that halacha l'maisa, the default designation, unless otherwise articulated, of a large mat is for schach purposes. Can you go ahead and make a schach mat for shchiva, for sleeping purposes? Can you? Of course. It would just require you to expressly articulate that that's the reason why you're making it. Suppose that's the opinion of Tanakama. Achos kitano, the achos gidola. So Rabbi Eliezer comes along and says, both a large mat as well as a small mat. Stama ksheru l'sichoch. We'll say again, anytime you have a mat and there is no express designation, the default designation ultimately is what? Schach. Schach. So we'll say, this is incredibly important. So what the Gemara is suggesting over here, Rav is suggesting over here, is that halacha l'maisa, the real machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim is regarding default designation. See, the Chachamim will hold that halacha l'maisa, the default designation of a small mat, is for shchiva, which again, just so you understand where they're coming from with that, when we say small, what's small? What's small? Size of a person, right? That's a small mat, because it was common that people would make these mats to lay down on. So the default designation of a small mat is for shchiva. The default designation of a large mat, ultimately again, is for schach. Rabbi Eliezer disagrees and he says, we don't make a distinction between large mats and small mats. Rather, all mats are created equal. And achos kitana, the achos gidola, whether it's a large mat or a small mat, stama ksheira l'sichoch. A stam mat, a non-designated mat, by definition is going to be kosher for schach. And those Rabbi Eliezer does not look at the size of the mat. he looks at designations. If it's designated, then it's when we say designated for shchiva, for sleeping, or for any other use, as we'll discuss as well. Then einach inami, it's a kli. If it's a kli, it's mekabel tuma. If it's mekabel tuma, it cannot be used for schach. Rabbi Eliezer will hold large mat, small mat. If it's undesignated, the default designation is for schach purposes and therefore usable for sukkah. So the Gemara says, Amar le Abaye. Abaye says, Ihachi. Rabbi Eliezer Omer achas kitana va'achas gedola. If that's the case, Rabbi Eliezer should really read a little bit differently in the Mishnah, right? Rabbi Eliezer said, right? You were saying achas gedola. Achas kitana achas gedola. He really should say achas gedola va'achas kitana mibayle. Shavo said, listen to this. So Abaye says to Rava, if you're correct, that Abaye doesn't make a difference between a large mat and a small mat. He holds any undesignated mat. The default designation is for schach. How should he have articulated that? See, the way Rava quoted it was achas kitana va'achas gedola. Whether it's a small mat or a large mat. Abaye says something wrong with what you're putting forward. Because how should it have read if you're truly correct? Achas gedola va'achas kitana. Then I will say why. Why does it make a difference what the order is? Because I will say, remember again, the large mat is the mat that you could get almost universal buy-in. That's stam l'sichuch, right? Because remember again, a large mat, even the Rabbanan are agreeing that the default designation of a large mat is for schach purposes. Rabbi Eliezer, you should have said achas gedola va'achas kitana, a large mat and a small mat. You wouldn't say a small. See, Rabbi Eliezer wants to make the argument that the default designation of any mat is for schach purposes until otherwise articulated that the mat's being used for some other purpose. If that's the case, you should have phrased it, whether it's a big mat or a small mat. Start with the one that's more obvious, that everybody agrees with, and then move on to the chiddush, as opposed to saying achas kitana v'achas gedola. We'll say an incredible musar. In life, it's not just what you say, but it's how you say it that makes a difference. So over here, the order of the achas kitana, achas gedola makes a dramatic difference. Says the Gemara Va'od. Furthermore, there's another problem, Rava, with your approach. Ki pligi bigdol hu de pligi. So the Gemara Rabbi Eliezer l'chumra. Furthermore, we have Rabbi Eliezer on record regarding arguing about a large mat as well. And not only that, but he argues l'chumra. Where do we find this, Rabbi Osai? Tisanya, machatzala sakanam bigdola mesachachin ba. If you have a large mat, you can use it for schach purposes. Rabbi Eliezer Omer im eina mekabelas tuma mesachachin ba. Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, you could use it as long as it's not mekabel tuma. So over here you have Rabbi Eliezer arguing in a case of machatzelas gedola, a large mat, and he's arguing l'chumra. So you see, so what Abaye is saying to Rava is, Rava, you make it sound like that in Rabbi Eliezer's world, a large mat is always okay. That's not true. That's not true. In regard to Rabbi Eliezer, there will be cases of a large mat which will be absolutely problematic. Ella, Amar Papa. So Boss says, try this again. Let's try this again. Ella Amar Papa. Bikitana kuli amalo pligi distamala shriva. So Papa wants to suggest as follows. With a large mat, an undesignated large mat, everyone will agree that it's permitted for use as schach. Why? The default designation of a large mat is... I'm sorry, just the... Let me say it differently. Sorry. With a small mat, everyone will agree that an undesignated small mat cannot be used for schach. Why not? The default designation of a small mat is shchiva. Good. Okay. Ki pligi. So where is the machlokes in the Rabbanon? Bigidola. With a large mat. So what's the machlokes? Here we go. Tanakama savar stam gidola l'sichoch. The Tanakama holds that a stam large mat, an undesignated large mat, is for schach. Now both say, when we say it's for schach, it means it's not for shchiva. People don't make large mats for laying down on. Therefore, by definition, its default designation is for schach. Rabbi Eliezer savar stam gidola nami l'shchiva. Rabbi Eliezer holds that no, even an undesignated large mat, at the end of the day, is for shchiva as well. So we'll say, so now, Rav Papa is coming along and advancing another model. In Rav Papa's model, when it comes to a small mat, everyone agrees. Everyone agrees on what? Stam small mat is what? Shchiva, unusable as schach. The machlokes case is stam large mat. The Rabbanon will hold stam large mat is usable because stam was made for schach. Rabbi Eliezer holds that no, stam mat is also made for shchiva. So what's interesting is as follows. In Rav Papa's model, pretty much what's going to happen according to Rabbi Eliezer is if you want to use a mat for schach, what has to happen? What has to happen? You need to actively designate it. That's the shift over here, right? Rabbi Eliezer pretty much, according to Rav Papa, in Rabbi Eliezer's world, the default designation of any mat is always going to be for shchiva. If you want to use it for schach, it has to be actively designated mitchila for that purpose. Umay asal l'shchiva. What does it mean that it was made for shchiva? The ka'amar hachi. The ka'amar hachi, ultimate the ka'amar, that you said it, you actively designate it, to which the Gemara says, hachi ka'amar stama siyasa nami l'shchiva ad da'avid l'sichoch. So what Rabbi Eliezer is saying is that halacha l'maisa, the stam designation, right, the default designation of mats, according to Rabbi Eliezer, is for sleeping purposes, until you expressly go ahead and make it for schach. We'll say, a mazel tov to Reb Michael on the marriage of his daughter last night. Mazel tov, mazel tov. He'll say, so says the Gemara, Tan Rabbanon. Let's go by. So we'll say, so this is Rav Papa's model. Tan Rabbanon. Machatzeles shel shifa v'shel gemi. So we'll say, so now, up until now, we've been speaking about a machatzeles shel kanim, which are reeds. The Gemara now here is gonna digress a little bit into mats made of other materials. So the truth is, the reason why this is going to make a difference just a bit is because depending on how hard the material is or how soft the material is, may dictate whether or not such a mat is used for shchiva, is used for sleeping. So it says the Gemara, machatzeles shel shifa v'shel gemi. If you have a machatzeles made of shifa or of gemi, so again, Rashi says over here, shifa, quotes, or gemi, dehein rakin. These are soft type of grasses, soft type of growths. Hilchach, so we'll say, so again, because they're soft, so like Rashi, machatzeles shel shifa v'shel gemi, gedola mesachachin ba. If it's large, you could use it for schach. Kitana ein mesachachin ba. If it's small, you can't use it for schach. I will say now, why? What's going on over here? So this, go back to that Rashi for just a moment. Rashi gemi. Rashi says, therefore, dehin rakin, they're soft. Therefore, hilchach, stam kitana yesh ban l'shchiva, lo shna gedol masa sharsh. So let's listen to this. So the idea of the Gemara is as follows. If you go ahead and you make a small mat of shefi, shifa and gemi, so these are soft growth, soft grasses, we'll call it. Therefore, the assumption is when you are making a small mat, what is that small mat going to be used for? What is it used for? Shchiva. A larger mat, ultimately, again, will be used for schach. So, gidola is misaking about. Kitan misaking about. Good. Next, shel kanim v'shel chilas. If you have kanim reeds, chilas, we'll say, is sedge. Also a type of grassy growth. Gidola misachachin ba. If you made a large mat out of it, you could use it for schach. Aruga in misachachin ba. We'll say aruga means if you've woven it together, then halacha l'maisa, it cannot be used for schach. Rashi says over here, aruga ein mesachachin ba. It's the third wide line on the bottom. This stama l'shchiva to lo hayu regilin lo arga el l'shchiva shetei chalaka v'nocha. You would only weave a mat if you wanted it to be comfortable and flat for sleeping purposes. So this is interesting. So now, just the Gemara is introducing. Up until now, we've been speaking about size. Now, what the Gemara is introducing us to is the idea that substance matters as well, right? In other words, what you're making it out of, and not only that, but sometimes how you're making it could also determine its use. So the Gemara goes right. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Mishum Aviv. Achas zu v'achas zu misachachin ba. Right? Rabbi Shmuel Bar Mitzva argues, he holds that you can go ahead and use for schach, use both of these types of mats for schach. Okay, v'chine Rabbi Dosa Omer kidvarav, and Rabbi Dosa held like him as well. Tanan Hasam, we learned kol hachotzlos mitamin tame meis. Divrei Rabbi Dosa. All chotzlos. So we'll discuss exactly what chotzlos are. Chotzlos are capable. So we're switching gears here. You're going to see why this is brought down here for just a moment. But we're going to figure out the halacha l'maisa with the mat discussion in just a little bit. So kol chotzlos mitamin tame meis. Divrei Rabbi Dosa. All chotzlos are subject to tumas meis. These are the words of Rabbi Dosa. The Chacham say medrus. Tumas medrus. Now, remember again, we saw that Tumas medrus. Medrus is tuma that is, let's say, from a zav or a zava or somebody who has tumas meis. Anytime a person who's tamei supports their weight upon something, even if there is not direct contact on it, that transmits tumas medrus. So the Gemara says, medrus in tamei meis lo. Ultimately, again, the Chachamim saying that it only transmits to that these chotzlos are mekabel tumas medrus and not tumas meis. The Gemara says v'hot anantanan. We learned kolamatame medrus mitame tame meis. Yet we learned that in general, whenever you go ahead and whenever you could contract tumas medrus, there's tumas meis that goes along with that. Ema af medrus. You know, the Chacham mean to say it could chotzlos could even contract tumas medrus. Okay, my chotzlos. By the way, what are chotzlos? What are chotzlos? You're telling me again, chotzlos are mekabel tumas meis, tumas medrus. What are chotzlos? So what's it is very interesting. Rav Avdimi bar Hamduri, Amar Rav Avdimi bar Hamduri, Marzubli, my Marzubli. What's Marzubli? Rabbi Abba Mizabli. So we'll say Mizabli are leather bags used by shepherds. Rashi says over here. No, not yet. Sorry. Mizabli. Bolos vasoy l'roa lahanichon tachas rosho l'shachei. So we'll say 3 lines are from the bottom. These were leather bags used by shepherds that they used to use as a pillow. It sounds like probably what happened was they were bags used to carry stuff, but they also at night doubled as a pillow for the shepherd. Okay. Rabbi Shimon Lakish Omar machzalos mamish. Rabbi Lakish says no. These refer to mats. We'll say that's why this is being brought down over here. This refers to mats that somebody would sleep on. And therefore, again, the Gemara is saying that a mat that someone sleeps on, a shchiva, is subject to tumas meis and tumas medrus. Va'azda Reish Lakish l'tamei. And Reish Lakish goes according to his reasoning. We'll say, listen to this. Damar Reish Lakish. We'll say, this is an incredible Gemara. Damar Reish Lakish. Harini kapharas Rabbi Chia ubanov. I should be in atonement for Rabbi Chia and his sons. Rabbi Chia and his sons had passed away already. So now Reish Lakish is going in and quoting them. And he says, I should be a kapara for them. Shebetchila, so we'll say, so let's look at this. Shebetchila, kishenishtach, we're going to read this section and we're going to go back and analyze it. Shebetchila, kishenishtachacha Torah mi Yisrael. And we'll say, in the beginning, Torah was forgotten from the Jewish people. Now, what is this referring to? This is referring to, if you look at Rashi says over here, we'll get the Aryeh Kaparas in just a second. Kishnishtachacha Torah mi Yisrael, lo nishtachacha kula ka'amar ela halacho shchuchos b'bnei b'ser. So let's listen to this. During the Churban, ultimately again, halachos were forgotten. That's what happened. The destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was so profoundly traumatic for Klal Yisrael that there were actually halachos that were forgotten. I will say, we've had this discussion before. I don't remember who it was, brought this up to me during Yuma. Like, you have these machloksim about what happened in the Beis HaMikdash. And, it's interesting that you had people who were around during the Beis HaMikdash time. How could it be that there's machlokus about how this was done, how that was done? So Soloveitchik has a beautiful piece where he discusses about trauma in general from loss, and how trauma from loss ultimately alters people's view of things. There's a fascinating story. I don't know where I was reading this, that a woman once came to go ahead and speak to Sigmund Freud. She met with Freud because she was constantly had the scent of burning bread. constantly had the scent of bread. Everywhere she went, she smelled burning bread. And they realized that this was not a physical issue. This was some type of psychological issue. So it's interesting. So, okay, it's a whole story, it's a whole arichos. But bottom line is, she worked in a bakery. Her husband came to tell her that they were getting divorced, and he was a real sweetheart. He told her at work. Right? So he comes to work, tells her we're getting divorced, and she was so upset by this. She had bread in the oven. The bread burned. So the scent of the bread was linked with her trauma, and so everywhere. So that scent remained with her. So trauma leaves these lingering effects, and part of it is that it often could alter the way you perceive reality. The destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was such an incredibly profound trauma that there were halachos that were forgotten. There were just halachos. There was a certain level of national consciousness that was altered as a result of the Churban. We think that the Churban, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash was a building. The buildings could be built. Buildings could be raised. Right? That's not the issue. It's what the Beis Hamikdash represented as the glue of Klal Yisrael, as the house of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it affected the entire Jewish consciousness to the point that the Gemara says over here that Kishabetchila Kishnishtachacha Torah mi Yisrael. Doesn't mean Torah was forgotten. It means there were halachos that were forgotten. So what happened? Allah Ezra mi Babel v'yasta. Ezra, when he came back, reestablished the forgotten halachos. Chazra v'nishtacha. So what happened? Then Torah was forgotten again. Now, interestingly enough, this was a result. I don't understand. Ezra rebuilt the Beis Hamikdash, so why was it forgotten again? So first of all, there was Churban again. But even before that, it wasn't the same. Remember again, when Ezra comes back from Bavel, only a fraction of Klal Yisrael goes back with him. There's a new dynamic of dispersion. There's a new dynamic of diaspora. There's a new dynamic of galus. So halachas continue to be forgotten. What happened? Allah Hillel Habavli v'yasda. Hillel came from Bavel and reestablished the halacha. So we'll say it is interesting to remember again, we saw this in Pesachim, that this was the story, Rashi quotes it, this was with Hillel and Bnei Beseira. Bnei Beseira were the leaders of the Jewish people at the time, and remember again, they did not know what to do with Karban Pesach when it falls out on Shabbos, right? And Hillel says, because you guys were not Mishamish Shmai Naftali, and you didn't spend enough time observing your Rebbeim, that's why you don't know the halacha. He gave them Musar. So Hillel came along and reestablished the halacha. Chazra v'nishtachacha. Ultimately, again, halachas were still subsequently forgotten. Allah Rabbi Chia ubanav v'yastu. Rabbi Chia and his sons came from Bavel, and ultimately, again, reinstated or retaught many of those halachas as well. I just want to point out something very interesting here, which is fascinating that in each of these situations, it was the Jews of the diaspora who came and reestablished the halacha on its foundations, which is really quite I'm not sure what to do with that, but it's really quite a fascinating dynamic. That nishtachacha Torah, and somehow again, Allah in each of these cases, Allah Ezra, Allah Hillel, Allah Rabbi Chia, ultimately, which tells you, well, we know what the Musar is, right? The Musar is that Torah is not complete while we are here. That's really what it comes down to. That Torah, there's always a chilek of Torah that's forgotten when Klal Yisrael is not in Eretz Yisrael. And ultimately, our Torah is really only a complete unit when it's Allah Ezra, Allah Hillel, Allah Rabbi Chia. Halavai, we should be zocha. So we'll say, so what happens when Rabbi Chia comes out? So Allah Rabbi Chia ubanav v'yastua. Okay, so why this whole introduction? So Am Rabbi Chia ubanav. So we'll say this whole introduction is because what happened? What did Rabbi Chia and his son say? Al Rabbi Chia ubanav lo nechleku Rabbi Yosef v'chachamim al machatzalos shal usha. Rabbi Yosef and Chacham did not disagree regarding the mats of usha. Of usha, that's what? Amadeis shehin tmeos, that the mats of usha are tamei. Then I will say, why was that? Because everyone knows that mats made in usha were made for sleeping purposes. So because they were made for sleeping purposes, therefore what? They're makabel tuma v'shel teveria, but the mats of teveria shehin tahoros, that they're tar. Rashi says why? What's wrong with the mats of teveria? Second line in Rashi chafam days kashosein because those mats are very hard. Everyone knows you don't sleep on Tiveria mats. It's a rookie mistake, right? Never sleep on Tiveria mats. So therefore, again, interestingly enough, the mats of Usha were exceptionally soft. Everyone slept on mats of Usha. So those are Mikabel Tumah. And everyone knows you never sleep on Tiveria mats because those are very hard and therefore no one sleeps on them. Alman nechlaku. So what's the machlokes about? Al shar mekomos, about mats that come from other places. Mar savar kevan deleka diyasev alayu k'Tiveria damyon. One says that in generally, people do not go ahead and sleep on mats, and therefore stam mats are like Tiveria mats, and therefore again they're not makabel tumah. Umar savar kevan the mikri diyasev alayu kidu usha damyon. And others say that halacha l'maisa, since sometimes people do sit on mats, halacha l'maisa, they're treated like the mats of Usha, and therefore are makabel tumah. Amar bar, kalachotzlos tamein tamimei. So let's listen to this. So actually, before we go ahead and we get to this, let me share with you a couple of things. So I suggest if we go back for just a moment, because this is really incredible. If you go back to if you go back to Reish Lakish's statement. So remember again, both say, just to give you once again context. So the context was we were having this discussion regarding these chotzlos, right? About chotzlos. Now, why are we getting into chotzlos? There's a machlokes as to what the definition of chotzlos are. But one of the opinions is that what are chotzlos? It's machatzalos. It's mats. That's why this is being brought down over here. What I just want to draw your attention to before we continue on in that conversation is Reish Lakish's dramatic statement. When Reish Lakish goes ahead and quotes Rabbi Chia and his sons, if you notice his lashon is Dam Reish Lakish, Harini kaparas Rabbi Chia ubanov. I will be an atonement for Rabbi Chia and his sons. What does that mean? What does that mean? So if you look at Rashi, back on Amud Aleph for just a moment, I'm sorry, I know we're going back and forth, I just wanted to finish off those lines. Look at Rashi, Harini kaparas, 3 lines up from the bottom, Yisurin haba'in alai, lechaparas al sherabi chia obanav yihiyu, v'loshen kavadhu, zesh kishemaskir aviv o rabo la'achar mitzaso, sarich lomar kain. So we'll say, this lotion of Harini kaparas mishkavo, or just Harini Kaparas. Here's Harini Kaparas in the Gemara. So is a way of what Rabbi Chia was saying was like this: allow my suffering to be an atonement for Rabbi Chia and his sons. Right? Let my atonement, let my suffering, my Yisurin, be an atonement for Rabbi Chia and his sons. I will say that statement reflects the idea that everyone has averos they have to deal with after 120. Right? So there is some level of something that happens, some level of kapara, some level of atonement that occurs for people after they die. So Rashi understands over here that it is a sign of respect that one says for their Rebbe, or one says for their father, after they pass away, whenever you mention their name, Harini Kaparas Mishkavo. May I be an atonement for his deathbed, which says, I hereby take upon myself any suffering that would come upon the neshama of my father, that would come upon the neshama of my Rebbe. I gladly take that suffering upon myself. So Rashi understands it over here to be Lashon Kavod. Lashon Kavod. And Rashi says, you say this both for a Rebbe as well as for a father. So also I'll tell you, this is in fact the halacha in Shulchan Aruch. So the Shulchan Aruch in Yaredeya, and the halachos of Kibbut Avvaim, Simin Reish Mem Sif Tes, writes as follows: Chayiv lechabdu afilu la'achar moso. One is obligated to honor their parents, or to honor their parents, I should say, to honor their parents, even after the death of the parent. This is a very important halacha. Kibbut Avvaim does not cease with the death of a parent; it continues afterwards. Keitzad, how do you honor your parent after death? Haya Omer davar shmua mipiv. Let's say you were saying something over in the name of your father. Omer. Kach Amar Abba Mari Harini Kaparas Mishkavo. That the proper statement to say after one mentions their father's name, and Rama points out, by the way, it's father and mother. It's no difference between father and mother, right? My father used to say, my father Harini Kaparas Mishkavo. May I be an atonement for his deathbed, which again is the way a son says. If my father's neshama is supposed to suffer because of anything he did during this lifetime, I take that suffering upon myself. Now I will say, interestingly enough, the only time you say this appellation is when? Imhu toch 12 chodesh. You only do this within the first 12 months after the death. V'imhu la'achar 12 chodesh, Omer, Zichrona Livracha. And again, after 12 months, then you say Zichrona Livracha. So Shulchan Aruch paskins, during the 12 months, we don't say Zichrona Livracha. I mean, you can say Zichrona Livracha also, but we say that phrase, Hareini kaparas mishkavo, may I be in atonement for his deathbed. After 12 months, you only say Zichrona Livracha. And I will say now why this shift after 12 months. So the Shach, listen to this. So the Shach says like this. First of all, he says, Gam tov yud beis chodesh, yochel lomar Zichrona Livracha. By the way, he says during 12 months, you can also say Zichrona Livracha. Rak tila achar yud beis chodesh, lo yomar hareini kaparas mishkavo. After 12 months, you cannot say hareini kaparas mishkavo. Why not? Mishum de mishpat rishoim begehenom rak yud beis chodesh. Because they both say the longest sentence that a person has in Gehenom is 12 months. It's 12 months. So if you say, so therefore we say hareini kaparas mishkavo for a parent for 12 months in the event that chas v'shalom the parent has to be in Gehenom. I say that, but not after 12 months. Not after 12 months. Both say, this is also one of the reasons we only say Kaddish for 11 months and not for 12 months, is to highlight the yisod that the child does not believe his parent was a rasha. That I believe that whatever my parent has to deal with in the afterlife, they would never be in Gehenom for a full 12 months, only for, the Shaila in the poskim. What happens if your parent was a rasha? What happens, right? There are, not just you didn't like him, not just my father never played catch with me on Sunday afternoons. I mean, like, Rahman al-Islam, there are parents who are Rishon. There are absolutely parents, there are parents who hurt their children emotionally, physically. What happens if you know your parent was a rasha? So the post can bring down, if a child knows his parent was a rasha, you can say Kaddish for the 12th month as well. That one would be permitted to do so because halacha l'maisa, that is a benefit for the neshama of the parent. But under normal circumstances, we stop at 11 months to highlight the belief that my parent was not a rasha. But again, I just want to point out, this is indeed halacha l'maisa of hareini kaparas mishkava, first 12 months after the parent's death. That's the appellation you add on to the name, but not past 12 months, because mishpat rishon begehenom is only 12 months. Interestingly enough, what Rashi's pointing out is that not only do you do this for a parent, and again, the Ramah points out, he says, ve'ein chiluk bein av le'ein b'chol zeh, again, everything, same thing, father, mother. What's interesting about the Gemara is you see you do this for a Rebbe as well. See this for Rabbi as well. So I'll just tell you something very interesting. Then we have to go on, and you can't hold me up anymore with these side discussions. I'll tell you something fascinating. So this is incredible. In the Marasham, the Shas Teshuvas Marasham, based on this Gemara, he asked a fascinating question. Listen to this. Dan bidvar mechira shemachar echal lechaveros ha'averos shalo imoel hadavar. So we'll see. He deals with the following shaila. In general, let's say my friend commits an avera. Can I accept the onesh of my friend's avera on me? Right? I love Ruvain. I love him. And I see he's really doing bad stuff. So can I say, Ribono Shalom, I hereby accept the punishment, right? Whatever Ruvain's doing bad stuff, I accept that onesh upon me, that punishment upon me. So the Marasham says, does such an idea work? He actually in this Shaili also deals with, can you go ahead and sell your averos to someone else? In other words, essentially it's the same shaila. Can you transfer liability from one person to another? And interestingly enough, the Marasham says, based on our Gemara, that there is the ability to transfer liability to someone else. That if a person wants to literally go ahead and absorb the chait liability of another, there actually is the ability to do so. This is based on our Gemara. The fact that I can say, Hareini kaparas mishkavo, by my father, by my Rebbe, I could say that. And that's not just a nice thing. That is literally a statement that says, I am willing to absorb the averus, and I'm willing to absorb the suffering in order to spare my father, my Rebbe, that suffering. The fact that you could do that means that there is some ability to transfer liability of averus from one person to another. Pretty incredible Gemara. All right, and we'll say let's go weiter. Somebody should start a website for this. I'm telling you, like the Avera exchange. You could. All right. Anyway, the Gemara says as follows. So let's go weiter. We'll say Amud Beis. Says the Gemara. Amar Mar. Kala choltzos metamin tamimes. Right. All choltzos have the ability to contract to Moses. Suppose remember again, cholzos was what we mentioned before. There's machlokes. Is it the leather bag of the shepherd? Is it a mat? So all cholzos are metame meis. Divrei Rabbi Dosa. These are the words of Rabbi Dosa. Aiva Tanya v'chin haya Rabbi Dosa Omer kidvarav. But yet again, we have on record Rabbi Dosa didn't hold like that. That Rabbi Dosa held like Rabbi Yossi. That halacha l'maisa, both types of mats can be used for schach purposes. So obviously, again, it's not a kli that's mekabel tuma. Lokasha had the isle gadanfa had the less like gadanfa. We'll say it depends. Does the mat have a rim or not? Now, what does it mean if the mat has a rim? Very simply, if the mat has a rim, then what can you do with the mat? Hold stuff in it. If you could hold stuff in it, then it becomes a receptacle. If it's a receptacle, it's a kli. And if it's a kli, it's makabel tuma. And if it's makabel tuma, it cannot be used for schach. So the Gemara says, Meisvei, chotzlos, shal sham, v'shal gemi, v'shal sak, v'shal sifra, mitame tame meisiv Rabbi Dosa. So Rabbi Dosa holds that Allah halamaisa, if you make chotzos of all these different materials, right? Sham was the grass. Gemi is also another type of grass. Sak, Rashi points out over here, is from wool of goats. And sifra, Rashi says over here, is from the hair on the neck or on the tail of a horse. So whatever you made your chotzos from, of any of these materials, Rabbi Dosa says, it's metami tumas meis. V'cham the chum say, af medras, even tumas medras. So let's analyze this. And I'm both saying, the Gemara is going to remember we have two different definitions of what chotzlos are. Are chotzlos the leather bags, or the bags of shepherds, or ultimately, again, are they the mats? So Bishma Lamandamar Marzubli, so according to the opinion who says that it's the bag of the shepherd, so Shal Sham, Vishal Gemi Chazul Kinsa Depiri. So if you make it out of Sham or Gemi, then it's usable. What is it usable for? Kinsa Depiri. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, you could use it to store large fruit. Because although there is a smaller hole, ultimately, again, in this bag, halach l'maisi can be used to store larger fruit. Shal sak v'shal sifra, if it's made of wool or out of horsehair, chazu legulki v'tsani. Then it's usable for gulki and sunny. What is gulki and sunny? Rashi says, kelim, kein sakin shnostem ben kitnius uperos dakin. It can be used even to hold smaller items. Because remember, again, anything you're making out of goat hair or horse hair is going to be very tightly woven. But according to the opinion, it says that chotzlos are really considered to be mats. I understand if you make it out of sak and sifra, if you make it out of goat hair and horse hair, what is it usable? For parsi and sifra and nafusa. Look at Rashi. Chazula parsi v'nafusa. Levilon, it's usable as a curtain. That's parsi. And ultimately, again, V'nafusa, Rashi says, as a sifter or a sieve. Our smichas chaver and Daf Yomi are intersecting. Right? Nafusa, Rashi says, l'nafos b'na kamach kimos shein. You could use it as a sifter or a sieve to go ahead and sift flour. Sheinosav kemach v'kol are good. So he goes, Ella shal sham v'shal gemi l'maychazu. But if you're talking about mats, if it's made out of sham and gemi, what is it usable for? Chazu l'nizyasa. It's usable to cover a vat of beer. Okay, you could use it as a vat cover. Good. Ika de Amri, an alternate version of this. According to the opinion who holds that chotzlos is actually real mats. Shal sham v'shal gemi. If it's made of sham and gemi, it's usable for what? Chazul and ziyasa. It's usable to cover a vat of beer. Shal sak v'shal sifra. If it's made ultimately out of goat hair or horse hair. Chazul leparsi v'nafusa. It's usable for a curtain and for a sift or a sieve. Elaman damar marzubli. But according to the opinion who holds that the machatzalos ultimately again is the bag of the shepherd. Bishlam v'shal sak v'shal sifra chazul gulki v'tsani. If it's made out of goat hair or horse hair, it's usable for gulki and sunny, which again, small items, small kalim. The Gemara says, "Ela shal sham v'shal gemi l'may chazu." But if it's made out of sham and gemi, what is it usable for? Chazul kinsa deperi. Ultimately, again, it'll be usable to hold large fruit. Good. Tanya, Rabbi Chananya, sorry. Kishi aradeti lagola. Rabbi Chananya says, when I went down to the gola, matzasi zakin echad va'amarli misachachin bevudja. found a particular elder man, and he told me that you are permitted to go ahead and use a budya for schach. I will say, what's budya? Rashi says machatzelas. It's a mat. Sorry. Okay. Sorry. Said disconnect. Good. He told me that you can go ahead and use a mat. When I came to Rabbi Yeshua, the father of the brother of my father, he said also you could use a mat. That's only if the mat does not have a rim. Right? Remember again, if it has a rim or an edge, remember why does that make it problematic? Because it could store things. And once it could store things, it has the definition of a kli. Amar Ula, Hani Bodisa Dibnei Mechuza, Ilmale Kir Shalahen, Misachachin Behu. So ultimately, again, so this Bodisa Dibnei Mechuza, this mat of Mechuza could be used for schach if it didn't have a kir. Rashi says kir is gidafna, is a rim. A brayso that supports this. Misachachin beboja, you can go ahead and use a mat. Then yesh lahen kir, but if it has an edge or a rim, in misachachin bahen, you are not permitted to go ahead and utilize that mat. So we'll say the discussion of mats is an interesting one in halacha. Again, a number of years ago there was a whole discussion about mats. The CRC, the Chicago Rabbinical Council, had put out under the direction of Gedaliah Dov Schwartz, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, that one did not have to purchase schach mats that were made l'shem schach. They were matir. These mats made by Home Depot. It created a whole thing. They kind of walked it back a little bit afterwards, because again, there are more intricate halachos concerning. Remember, when it comes to mats, just to point this out, let me read you first the Shulchan Aruch. Just the halacha l'maisa based on the sugya. So I'll say this is the Shulchan Aruch Simin Taf Reish Chaf Tes halacha Vav Sif Vav. Just the basic halacha. B'machatzela shakonim v'kasha shiva v'gemi bein shu chalaka bein shu l'shchiva bein shu ina chalaka sheniru l'shchiva imi ketana stama omedes l'shchiva mekabel estoma vein misachachin ba ela imkein asa l'sichoch. So the first thing the Shulchan Aruch says is a small mat, stam mat, we assume is made for shchiva. So that's the position the Shulchan Aruch adopts. That a stam small mat, can't use it for schach. Now again, when I say can't use it for schach, because we assume the default designation of a small mat is for shchiva. Now again, I will say the Gemara says the Haggah, the Ramah comments, the Hainu shirov b'nei osair osin osa l'sichoch. I'm sorry. Now, obviously, with a small mat, if you made it l'shem schach, if you made it for schach purposes, then what? Then of course it's okay. What it means is, stam, you come across a small mat. The Shulchan Aruch says you cannot use that for schach because you have to assume that it was made for shchiva purposes. Therefore, it's a kli. Therefore, you can't use it. Vimhi gedola stama, but if it's a stam large mat, omedes l'sichoch. So again, halacha will say is a stam small mat cannot be used for schach. A stam large mat can be used for schach. Unless of course it was made for shchiva. Unless of course again it was made ultimately again for laying down on it. So he goes on. And this is all assuming that the mats in question do not have a rim. So we'll say it's interestingly enough, the way the Shulchan Aruch paskins is stam small mat is assumed for shchiva, can't be used. Stam large mat assumed for schach or not for shchiva can be used. If the mat has a rim, ultimately again it's problematic. Listen to what the Ramah says. Haggah b'makom shenagu likba machatzelos begagin kein tikra in mesachin bain. But if you live in a place where people often use these mats for roofs or for building purposes, then halacha l'maisa, you cannot use it for schach. Which again makes sense because once it's being used, once it was created for roof purposes, then again it also has the status of a kli, and halacha l'maisa would be problematic. So we'll say, so again, Shulchan Aruch adopts the position, stam, large mat, usable, assumed for sichuch, stam, small mat, can't be usable, because again, the assumption is made for shchiva. Also, just point out in the discussion regarding schach mats, one of the interesting things also just to add into the mix over here is there's another issue when it comes to schach mats, which is not just the use of it, but what the bamboo itself is actually tied together with. That is a separate discussion regarding davar hama'amid, right? In general, again, when it comes to schach, the same way that there are halachos that govern what you could put the schach on, right? Remember, again, you have a metal frame sukkah. We will discuss. You don't place the schach resting right on the metal frame. Again, there are poskim who say that you can, but l'maisa we try not. We try to put the schach on something that itself is kosher the schach. That which holds the schach together is also subject to many of the halachos of schach as well. So that's why many of the poskim hold that, technically speaking, even though just that, this is why many pushed back on the CRC's designation as well, because again, it's not just about the mat itself; it's what the mat is held together with. Okay, I will say so again, beyond the scope of our discussion this morning, to get into the full discussion regarding schach mats. But halacha l'maisa, at least now you know. Now you have a conceptual underpinning: large mats, stam good; small mats, stam not. But again, I will say, but either mat could be repurposed anyway if explicitly repurposed either for shchiva or ultimately for schach.